Hello, and welcome to Sleep Haven. Tonight, we're taking a journey through time and space, exploring one of history's most amazing networks, the Silk Road. So get comfortable, let your body settle, and allow your breathing to slow. And if you prefer an off-screen experience without distractions, you can listen on Spotify. The link is in the description below. Now, let your thoughts drift as we begin this journey. Long before airplanes or trains, before modern roads or highways, people needed ways to move from one place to another. Some paths were narrow trails through hills. Others stretched across valleys or along riverbanks. Over centuries, these routes connected distant lands. Collectively, they became known as the Silk Road. It was not a single road, but a network that carried people, goods, and ideas. The Silk Road began in small, deliberate steps. A trader in ancient China might plan a journey lasting months or even years. Every decision required thought. Travelers had to consider the land. Deserts shifted with the wind, rivers changed with the seasons, and mountains rose steep and demanding. Each landscape taught travelers to pay attention, to move carefully, and to adapt to what they encountered. In the earliest days, the Silk Road connected villages to larger towns. Farmers, artisans, and traders found value in moving their goods to distant markets. Silk made in China could travel thousands of miles, appearing in cities far away. Spices added new flavors to meals, while metals and rare items traveled alongside them. These exchanges were about more than commerce. They were about noticing the possibilities of the world and sharing them. The routes themselves were not always obvious. Travelers relied on natural landmarks, a mountain peak, a river bend, a plateau in the distance. They measured journeys by days rather than miles, pausing when necessary to let animals rest and travelers regain energy. These pauses became part of the rhythm of travel, and observing the environment closely allowed people to move safely across unfamiliar lands. Over time, the Silk Road expanded. New paths emerged as traders found safer or faster routes. River valleys provided natural corridors, and mountain passes offered shortcuts. Desert crossings demanded careful planning, yet caravans of camels moved steadily across the sands. Each journey offered lessons about the weather, the seasons, and the patterns of the land. Travelers learned to read these signs, adjusting their pace and plans along the way. Along the Silk Road, travelers noticed more than geography. They observed plants and animals, the way different regions looked and changed with the seasons. Fertile lands were dotted with fields of grain. In drier regions, shrubs and oases offered occasional shelter and water. Camels, horses, and donkeys became reliable companions, learning to navigate the terrain alongside the people. Movement along the Silk Road was a partnership between humans, animals, and the land itself. Trade hubs appeared along the way, small towns or resting points where merchants could resupply and exchange information. These stops became centers of learning. A conversation at a market could share techniques, ideas, or discoveries. Knowledge traveled as naturally as silk or spices. Every journey added to the collective understanding of how to move safely and effectively across the vast network of routes. The Silk Road grew with the accumulation of experience. Maps were drawn carefully, noting rivers, mountains, and safe passages. Travelers shared advice about seasonal changes, weather patterns, and local customs. The network of information became as important as the roads themselves. Each journey contributed to a shared understanding of the world, shaping how future travelers moved and learned. The landscapes themselves were instructive. Imagine dunes shifting under the morning sun, mountain ridges rising into the sky, and rivers reflecting clouds and the occasional caravan. Travelers learned to navigate by observing patterns in nature. Their knowledge grew with each step, and the paths they followed were shaped by observation, experience, and patience. Endurance was essential. Travelers paced themselves and their animals carefully. Food and water were rationed, and rest was necessary. Every day of travel was a practice in planning and observation. This steady pace allowed people to connect distant cultures, exchange goods and ideas, and create a lasting network that would influence societies for centuries. Even small details mattered. A carved marker on a rock could guide a caravan. A shaded grove offered a place to pause. Wind, sun, and stars became tools for navigation. Travelers learned to read these signs and adjust their steps accordingly. Observing the paths themselves reveals the essence of the Silk Road. It was a system built on movement, observation, and learning. The landscape taught travelers to notice details, adapt to change, and understand the passage of time. The roads were the first layer of a network that would carry goods, knowledge, and culture across the world. Take a moment now to imagine yourself walking along these ancient roads. Feel each step as part of a journey across time, noticing the land and the movement of people who came before. As travelers moved along the Silk Road, they carried more than their own belongings. Their caravans were full of items that reflected the lives, skills, and creativity of the people who made them. Trade required careful planning. Merchants thought about the durability of their goods, the conditions of the journey, and the needs of the people who would receive them. Each object had a purpose and a story, and each journey shaped connections between distant lands. Silk was among the most famous and valuable items. In the workshops of ancient China, threads were spun, dyed, and woven into fabrics. Traders packed bolts of silk with care, knowing these delicate materials would travel thousands of miles. Silk was prized not only for its texture and colour, but for the craftsmanship it represented. Spices were another essential commodity. Cinnamon, pepper, and cardamom moved slowly across mountains and deserts, transforming food in distant regions. These small, fragrant items added flavour to meals and introduced new experiences for people who had never seen them before. Spices were valuable not only for taste, but for the effort it took to transport them safely over long distances. Paper and ink travelled alongside silk and spices. The invention of paper allowed knowledge to move from one place to another. Scholars could send messages, preserve important records, and share ideas across regions. A single sheet of paper might pass through many hands before reaching its destination, carrying with it information that could influence lives and decisions. Metals and gemstones were carefully packed to prevent damage. Coins made in one empire often circulated in another, facilitating trade and exchange. Precious stones were admired for their rarity and beauty. Even everyday items like pottery, tools, and textiles gained new significance when they moved across regions, carrying information about the cultures that produced them. Transporting these goods required skill. Caravans were organized according to the type of items they carried. Fragile objects were placed in the center of a group of pack animals, cushioned with straw or cloth. Heavier goods were distributed evenly to prevent overloading. Travelers considered terrain, water sources, and seasonal changes. Every choice affected how safely the goods would arrive. Markets and resting points along the route allowed merchants to trade, learn, and observe. Traders could see which products were in demand and adjust their cargo for future journeys. Local artisans often discovered new materials or techniques by handling objects from faraway regions. In this way, trade was a form of learning, spreading knowledge alongside goods. Some items had cultural or symbolic value. Religious artifacts, musical instruments, and decorative pieces travelled across continents, carrying meaning beyond their material form. People treated these items with care and respect, understanding that they represented beliefs, traditions, and skills from distant lands. The circulation of objects encouraged innovation. Techniques observed in one region could be adapted elsewhere, leading to new methods of weaving, pottery, metalwork, or painting. Each interaction gradually spread skills and knowledge, enriching local communities and creating connections across great distances. Trade often involved sharing stories about the items themselves. Merchants explained how a spice was grown or the method used to weave a piece of cloth. Even ordinary objects could teach lessons about geography, climate, or human creativity. Through these exchanges, goods became a bridge for understanding the world beyond one's own village or town. The scale of caravans varied. Some journeys included hundreds of items and animals, while others travelled light, focusing on fewer goods, but with greater care. Larger caravans provided security and shared labour. Smaller ones allowed for faster movement and more attention to detail. Each method reflected practical choices based on the type of goods, terrain, and distance. Timing was also important. Some goods moved seasonally to preserve freshness or take advantage of favorable weather. Traders learned when to depart, which routes to follow, and how to store fragile items. These decisions ensured that goods arrived in good condition and remained valuable to their recipients. Trade along the Silk Road created connections between people as well as places. A merchant from one region could meet a trader from another, exchange techniques, and discover new materials. These interactions were gradual and practical. Over time, they built networks of knowledge and expertise that spanned thousands of miles. Strategies to protect goods were essential. Containers were labeled to indicate contents and destination. Wrapping fragile items in cloth or straw reduced breakage. Understanding seasonal changes and natural obstacles allowed travelers to plan departures and routes carefully. Small, practical steps ensured that trade remained reliable and productive. The movement of goods shaped societies. A new fabric, a rare spice, or a technique learned from an object could subtly influence local customs and practices. Over time, these small changes accumulated, leaving a lasting impact on the cultures connected by the Silk Road. Trade was never just about material objects. Each item carried lessons about human creativity, adaptation, and resourcefulness. Objects facilitated learning and exchange. People who never traveled themselves could encounter new materials, techniques, and ideas through the goods that reached their communities. Imagine the items on a caravan. Rolls of silk, carefully wrapped. Containers of spices, fragrant and colourful. Coins and gemstones nestled in straw. Think of the hands that prepared, packed, and handled these goods, the choices made to protect them, and the long journeys they undertook. Each item reflects human skill and thought, moving steadily from one place to another, connecting distant lands in tangible ways. By observing these treasures, we understand how trade influenced more than economies. It spread knowledge, skills, and ideas, shaping human understanding across regions. Alongside the movement of goods, the Silk Road carried ideas. Travelers brought with them observations, inventions, and discoveries, passing them from one place to another. Knowledge moved in different ways, through conversation, demonstration, and careful copying. Unlike objects, ideas could be reproduced and shared repeatedly, spreading beyond local borders and connecting distant communities. Astronomy was one form of knowledge that travelled widely. Scholars and merchants noted patterns in the stars, the behaviour of the moon, and seasonal changes. Observations from one region informed calendars in another, helping people plan farming, festivals, and trade. Simple diagrams, sketches, and calculations moved with travellers, gradually expanding understanding of the world. Mathematics was another field that crossed regions. Counting systems, methods for calculation, and basic geometry were adapted to fit different needs. Merchants used these tools for trade, architects for building, and administrators for planning cities. Even small changes, like new numerical symbols or practical techniques for measurement, could influence everyday life far from where they originated. Medical knowledge travelled as well. Remedies, procedures, and practices passed between physicians and traders. Herbal treatments, basic surgical methods, and approaches to health spread slowly, influencing local medicine. People learned not just about the materials, but also the reasoning behind different practices, enriching understanding of health across cultures. The exchange of ideas was often subtle. A traveller might show a weaving method or a technique for storing grain. Artisans learned new approaches by watching and practicing. Knowledge was rarely presented formally. It spread naturally, integrated into existing customs and habits. Religious and philosophical thought also travelled. Pilgrims and scholars shared teachings, rituals, and stories. Ideas about ethics, social conduct, and spirituality crossed borders, inspiring adaptation in local communities. These exchanges contributed to blended practices and belief systems that reflected multiple influences. Education benefited from this circulation of ideas. Schools, libraries, and centers of learning incorporated new techniques and information from afar. Written texts moved between regions, while travelers also shared lessons orally. Even those who could not read observed practices and learned from experience, gaining access to knowledge beyond their immediate surroundings. Technological innovations moved alongside trade. Improvements in irrigation, construction, tools, and transportation were observed and applied in new regions. A simple invention in one area could inspire broader changes elsewhere. Over time, these small adjustments accumulated, shaping how communities worked and lived. Artistic techniques were exchanged as well. Patterns, designs, and decorative approaches travelled along the routes. Artisans combined new ideas with local traditions, producing unique styles that reflected multiple influences. Even minor changes in colour, form, or method contributed to evolving artistic expression. Everyday knowledge travelled too. Recipes, techniques for preserving food, and methods for working with materials moved from one community to another. Gradually, local practices adapted, leading to small improvements in daily life. Each observation added to a shared understanding, improving efficiency, comfort, and skills across regions. Sharing knowledge required attention and careful observation. Travellers noted what worked, what failed, and how people responded to different methods. This practical learning became part of the collective experience. Skills and ideas spread quietly, connecting people and societies over long distances without urgency or spectacle. Over generations, the flow of knowledge reshaped civilizations. Observations from one region could influence distant communities hundreds of miles away. Methods, ideas, and discoveries accumulated slowly, creating networks of understanding that spanned continents and endured over time. Picture a scholar traveling with a caravan. They carry charts, diagrams, or written notes, exchanging what they know with those they meet. Each conversation, demonstration, and observation contributes to a larger body of knowledge. Even small insights move steadily, reaching places far from their origin, influencing communities and practices along the way. The Silk Road shows how knowledge and commerce were intertwined. Ideas travelled alongside material goods, influencing agriculture, medicine, mathematics, technology, and art. Each piece of information, observation, or skill added to a growing network of understanding, linking people across distances and generations. The Silk Road was more than a route for goods and ideas. It became a place where cultures encountered one another. Merchants, travellers, and artisans carried traditions, customs, and practices across great distances. Over time, these interactions shaped local communities, creating connections that linked distant societies in subtle and meaningful ways. Markets along the route were not only centres of trade, but spaces for observation and exchange. People from different regions met, shared techniques, and discovered new approaches. A potter from the mountains might notice a unique glaze in a river town. A textile worker from the desert could study patterns in fabrics from faraway cities. These encounters allowed skills and creativity to spread naturally alongside the flow of goods. Language adapted as communities interacted. Words and phrases travelled with merchants, becoming part of local vocabulary. Travellers learned to communicate across differences, creating bridges between regions. Over time, these exchanges influenced everyday speech and even local dialects, leaving traces of distant lands in daily communication. Art also reflected cultural blending. Motifs, designs, and symbols moved between regions. Patterns in a rug, the shape of a vase, or the style of a painting could originate hundreds of miles away. Local artisans incorporated these elements into their own work, producing creations that merged multiple influences. Over generations, these blended styles became a hallmark of the Silk Road's cultural impact. Music travelled as well. Instruments, melodies, and rhythms accompanied traders and performers. People learned new ways to play, sing, or combine sounds. These influences were gradually absorbed into local traditions, shaping how communities express themselves through music and performance. Food and cooking practices were another form of exchange. Ingredients unknown in one region added new flavors and inspired new dishes. Recipes were observed, adapted, and passed along, combining local ingredients with techniques learned from travelers. Meals became a reflection of cultural connections, showing how even daily routines carried distant influences. Daily life also changed through observation and adaptation. travelers introduced methods for cooking, storing food, and building homes. Techniques for weaving, pottery, and metalwork were shared and adapted. Communities incorporated what worked best, shaping their practices over time. Religious and spiritual traditions blended as people moved along the routes. Pilgrims, monks, and travelers introduced rituals, festivals, and teachings. Communities adopted, adapted, or merged these practices, creating traditions that reflected multiple influences. These exchanges enriched local, cultural, and spiritual life. Architecture absorbed new ideas as well. Builders noticed structures and designs from distant regions, incorporating new techniques into their own work. Features such as archways, decorative patterns, or structural methods were adapted to local conditions. The resulting buildings reflected a combination of distant inspiration and local innovation. Social customs also evolved. Travelers observed greetings, gestures, and etiquette in other regions. Communities adopted practices that fit their daily lives, while also sharing elements of their own culture with newcomers. These exchanges influenced manners, routines, and patterns of interaction, leaving traces of distant societies in everyday life. Trade fairs and temporary gatherings played an important role. Merchants, artisans, and performers met in towns along the routes. They demonstrated skills, shared techniques, and exchanged ideas. These gatherings allowed communities to observe innovations firsthand, incorporating them into local crafts, commerce, and routines. Even stories and oral traditions travelled along the routes. Tales of heroes, animals, or natural events were shared and adapted, often reflecting local landscapes and experiences. Over time, these narratives became part of the cultural fabric, illustrating the ways communities borrowed and reshaped ideas. Communities learned to adapt to the diversity brought by travelers. Exposure to new techniques, customs, and ideas encouraged flexibility and creativity. People experimented, refined their methods, and integrated innovations into daily life. Over time, this openness strengthened societies, creating rich traditions shaped by both local and distant influences. Picture walking through a busy Silk Road market. Merchants call out in different languages. Stalls display pottery, textiles, and spices from faraway regions. Musicians play unfamiliar instruments, and children hear new words from passing travelers. Every exchange reflects a blending of distant worlds, each person contributing to a shared network of culture. The Silk Road demonstrates that human interaction can shape communities in lasting ways. Cultures met, observed, and adapted, influencing art, music, language, architecture, and daily life. These exchanges created subtle yet enduring change. Over time, movement along the Silk Road began to shift. There was no single turning point. Instead, change unfolded gradually as new routes appeared and different choices became available. For many centuries, caravans crossed deserts and mountains, linking distant regions. These journeys depended on planning, experience, and a strong awareness of the landscape. As knowledge expanded, however, new ways of travelling began to take shape. One of the most important changes came from the sea. Coastal trade had existed for a long time, but improvements in shipbuilding and navigation made longer sea journeys more dependable. Ships could carry large quantities of goods and move steadily across open water without the need to pass through difficult terrain. For many merchants, this offered a practical alternative. Instead of spending months guiding caravans across land, goods could be loaded onto ships and transported across great distances by water. Ports grew busier as more trade shifted in that direction. Over time, maritime routes became a central part of long-distance exchange. As this shift continued, activity along some overland routes began to decrease. Caravans still moved across the land, but less frequently. The long lines of camels that once appeared regularly became harder to find. Journeys were spaced farther apart, and familiar routes saw fewer travellers. This transition did not happen quickly. It took place over many years as merchants adjusted their plans and explored new options. Some continued using traditional paths, especially for shorter distances. Others moved toward coastal regions, where ships connected distant markets more directly. Along the Silk Road, cities and towns responded in different ways. Some places that had once been busy centres of exchange experienced a gradual slowdown. Markets that once displayed goods from many regions became more focused on local trade. Other cities adapted to new conditions. They developed different roles, serving nearby regions or shifting toward new forms of commerce. In some cases, they remained active and relevant, even as the larger network around them changed. These adjustments were part of a broader pattern. Human movement has always responded to opportunity and efficiency. As new routes became available, older ones were used differently. Technology played a key role in this process. Advances in navigation allowed sailors to travel with greater confidence across open water, knowledge of wind patterns, ocean currents, and seasonal changes made long voyages more predictable. Ships became stronger and better suited for carrying large amounts of cargo. With these developments, sea travel became a preferred option for many traders. Still, the land routes did not disappear. In many regions, they continued to support local trade. Merchants moved between nearby towns, carrying goods that were better suited for shorter journeys. These smaller networks remained active, even as long-distance caravan travel became less common. In this way, the Silk Road did not come to a clear end. Instead, it changed shape. What had once been a wide network connecting distant regions became a series of more localized routes. The scale shifted, but the movement of goods and people continued. As the number of long-distance caravans decreased, something important remained. The knowledge, traditions, and practices that had travelled along these routes had already become part of the communities that received them. Farming methods, artistic styles, languages, and ideas continued to develop within their new environments. In cities that had once welcomed travellers from far away, signs of these connections could still be found. Architectural details reflected outside influences. Textile patterns showed designs that had travelled across regions. Words borrowed from other languages remained part of everyday conversation. Even as fewer travellers passed through, the results of earlier exchanges continued to shape daily life. In this way, the Silk Road left its mark not through constant movement, but through what had already been shared. Today, the legacy of the Silk Road can still be seen in many aspects of the modern world. Trade routes now span continents through different means. Goods move across oceans, through the air, and along railways. Communication connects people across great distances in an instant. Yet the underlying idea is familiar. People continue to exchange goods, share knowledge, and learn from one another. The methods have changed, but the purpose is much the same. The Silk Road reminds us that these connections developed over time, shaped by individuals making decisions, adapting to new conditions, and building relationships step by step. As this journey comes to a close, we can reflect on how these routes once brought distant regions closer together. They were not defined by a single moment, but by many small actions repeated over generations. And even as the roads grew quieter, their influence remained. The paths may no longer carry the same steady flow of caravans, but the ideas, skills, and traditions that travelled along them continue to move through the world in new forms. In that sense, the Silk Road did not disappear. It became part of a larger, ongoing story, one that continues wherever people connect, exchange, and learn. Thank you for allowing me to guide you into rest tonight. I hope this episode helps you relax and drift into a restful sleep. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel to join us for future episodes. Sharing this podcast with friends or loved ones can help them find calm and rest as well. Sleep well, and may your night be peaceful and your dreams gentle.